You're listening to Heritage Radio Network. Okay, hello listeners. Welcome back to From the Pantry. We are in our second episode of our second arc called The Cult of Chef with Hannah Chouinard. Hannah, hi. Welcome back. Hello.
Hey.
Hello. You have a surprise for me that I have been waiting for days. It's been hot in my email inbox and I am ready. So what am I getting myself into today?
Yeah, I'm really excited to react to this and laugh at this. So this is a clip that I found on the internet. And it is Gordon Ramsay on an episode of Hell's Kitchen, just doing his Gordon Ramsay thing.
Where's the lamb sauce?
Come on, man.
I just need it.
This is the lamb.
Where's the lamb sauce?
Right here, chef.
Lamb sauce is coming up.
There's just nothing coming together.
Right here, chef.
Thank you very much.
Not a problem, chef.
Oh, fuck off you fat, useless sack of fucking Yankee danky doodle shite.
Holy shit. I'm not shocked because I have been called crazy things. My first fine dining chef owner boss told me, because I was sick, he told me that I had, quote, the constitution of wet cardboard, end quote. And that was on the nicer things that he said. And I actually thought it was funny until I recently started telling people about this. And I've only gotten horrified reactions. So I'm like, maybe I should revisit my Filofax of the insults that I've been called and really, really run through my trauma again. But tell me more about this secret audio that you just had us all listen to.
I wanted to start the episode with this because often when I talk to people about workplace abuse in restaurants, this is the kind of thing they think I'm talking about. People imagine angry, volatile chefs screaming and spitting and throwing temper tantrums as the quintessential harm taking place in restaurants. We established in episode 1 that we love to love chefs, but we also love to hate them. The Gordon Ramsay type is a trope in media covering restaurants. It's loud, it's flashy, and it evokes emotion without much storytelling necessary. Sometimes that emotion is glee at the sheer absurdity.
God!
And sometimes it's horrified shock and anger. This sort of thing is obvious and easy to digest, even if it upsets us. But the reality of abuse in food service is much sneakier. It skulks silently in our paychecks that are always a few dollars short, in underhanded comments about how our bodies make guests feel, in requests for promotions that get rejected with no explanation or conversation. For most of us in the industry, a sweaty white man with anger issues is the least of our problems. How did you get started in food service?
Ooh, okay. Let me give you the TLDR. I started as coffee girl when I was 15 at our local bakery. Got a sandwich thrown in my face, went to court to testify against that guy as a minor. That was crazy. But when I finished my master's in 2019, I specifically wanted to move into fine dining because I thought it was very important to combine my education with my love of hospitality and get another dimension of it. But I found this really little restaurant in the heart of Amsterdam. But it was an interesting place to work. I was very enthusiastic and eager to work with someone who also shared a mixed ethnicity, heritage, and mixed cultural background. But there was a moment about a month and a half into my time working at this restaurant where the chef had been invited to speak about mental health and hospitality and how focused he was specifically on it and incorporating that into our team dynamics. And then that man immediately turned around and used his emotional intellect to manipulate me, my desire to learn, my curiosity around hospitality, and my love for the pure form of hospitality of being in service to others. And he was the most toxic boss I've ever had. He was all of 2 years older than me. And at one point, he told me that he considers himself a father figure to me. It was really gross. Our first few conversations about hospitality were very aligned. I firmly believe that this person genuinely wanted to do things differently, but it was so ingrained in his identity as a restaurateur, as someone who exists in hospitality, to be abusive. He was abused, and so he was only able to, in those moments, choose to abuse me as well.
Basically, every food service person I know has some horror story about a chef or a manager who was a nightmare to work for. Sometimes they scream in workers' faces or throw things at them, but it's usually a lot more subtle. People in these positions are notorious for their emotional abuse, cutting people down and degrading their confidence. They make workers feel small and insignificant. For more than 14 million workers, labor issues go far beyond cruel bosses. Food service is incredibly segregated, split by race and gender, with white men occupying the highest paying positions. Everyone else works for some of the lowest wages in the country. Even if you do earn a living, there's no guarantee you'll actually see that reflected on your paycheck. According to data from the Economic Policy Institute, almost 84% of restaurants committed some type of wage theft between 2010 and 2012. And there's little recourse for workers who suspect their employers are stealing from them, especially for undocumented workers that make up between 10 and 40% of the food service labor force. Food service has the highest rates of sexual harassment claims of any industry in the country, and that only considers people who are willing to talk about it. It's pretty common to hear people talk about how we don't need protections for food service workers because of who those workers are perceived to be. The cultural image of a restaurant worker is a teen or 20-something paying their way through college. You know, a kid flipping burgers probably doesn't need a retirement fund or insurance or PTO. I'm gonna gloss over the fact here that young people also deserve labor rights, but even if they didn't, this image would still be wrong. A vast majority of restaurant workers are over 25, and almost a third of them are over 40. These are adults, and many of them have families to support. These are huge problems, and they've been plaguing the industry basically since its inception, but there are people yelling loudly to try to change things. One is Saru Jayaraman, the leader of Rock United and One Fair Wage. These are industry advocacy groups fighting to raise wages and enhance food workers' rights while documenting the ubiquity of workplace abuse. These organizations are big on data. Rock alone has published dozens of reports on topics like racial discrimination and sexual harassment, challenges for parents in the industry, and the threat of heat exhaustion for back-of-house workers. Though they cover a lot, their big focus is on the tipped wage. The layperson might see tips as a bonus on top of wages, but in the US, they actually function as a stand-in. The tipped sub-minimum wage is a loophole for employers to pay less than the federally mandated minimum wage guaranteed to all other workers in the country. The history of this exemption is tightly intertwined with the history of slavery and misogyny. Rock United and One Fair Wage see the sub-minimum tipped wage as the root of all restaurant labor evils. Here's Jayaraman in an interview with Kiki Luya on the HRN series Shift Work, discussing how the sub-minimum wage can put workers in dangerous and uncomfortable situations.
So nationwide, actually the median wages for both front and back of house are pretty similar, actually. They are in the $10 range, including tips. On the whole, the restaurant industry is the lowest paying workforce in the United States of America, hands down. 7 states have gotten rid of this, but the overwhelming majority of workers in the 43 states that persist with this legacy of slavery are women, and disproportionately women of color. Overwhelmingly women working in very casual restaurants and bars, suffering from the highest rates of poverty and economic instability of any workforce in America, and the absolute highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry because they have to tolerate inappropriate customer behavior to get tips.
When your paycheck is dependent upon the benevolence of strangers, you'll do just about anything to make them happy. I've experienced this firsthand in my time as a server at fine dining restaurants. I've had men rub my arms and touch the small of my back. A patron once asked me to flirt with his sad brother in exchange for a $200 tip. An investor in a restaurant I worked at in college pointed at a female bartender and bragged that he could, quote, buy a girl like her in Thailand. By restaurant standards, I've been pretty lucky. These feel tame compared to the stories I've heard from other people in the industry, but they still made me feel horrible. Something I'm sure the nearly 90% of female servers who report experiencing sexual harassment can relate to. Rather than a human being with thoughts and feelings and agency, I became an object for the admiration of rich men who could touch and caress at their will. When things like this happened, I would turn to my fellow workers and we would commiserate about bad characters that frequented the restaurant. We shared stories about which managers to avoid being alone with and which tables to pass off to male coworkers. There was solidarity among those subjected to the deluge of harassment, but not action. I never confronted those guests or complained to someone who could actually do something about it. It's common knowledge in the industry that you put up with these things because rent is on the line. Often when I have conversations about this stuff with people outside of the restaurant world, they're shocked. They have no idea how little restaurant workers get paid or what working conditions are like. For many non-industry folks, their only experience with the inner workings of restaurants are seeing them portrayed on TV. Watching a show like The Bear, yet another series that centers and romanticizes an abusive chef, can feel like an eye-opening look into the industry. As we discussed in episode 1, a big part of the issue is that most often when we hear about restaurants, we're seeing an incredibly sanitized view that focuses exclusively on the chef. Even if they're cast as a villain a la Gordon Ramsay, they still exude a sort of magical, creative genius. What we don't get to see are the people working for them, the people who are actually cooking the food, taking orders, and wiping up tables after customers. Contrary to what Chef's Table might suggest, their lives are just as important and complicated as the person deciding which edible flower to tweeze on top of their signature roasted half chicken. But we don't often get to hear their stories, or hear about how the person with the tweezers groped them behind the bar or made them cry during pre-shift. One person bringing some light to the lives of those other workers is Julia Moskin. She's a reporter for the New York Times who writes, among other things, about workplace abuse in food service. She pushes back on the conventional narrative by centering the experience of workers who are being mistreated, rather than the star chefs who employ them.
It is often very difficult given the way, chefs compete for media attention. They are very unlikely to suggest that you talk to their line cooks. And to be honest, I think it's been the perception, among us in the media that that's not what our readers want to know about, that our readers want to know about the creative geniuses and the fascinating twists, and when someone went and did a stage at Noma or lived in Spain for a year. And I know that we have to do a better job of making interesting and legible and urgent the lives of people who are not at the head of the kitchen.
It's no secret that we love stories about people who do impressive and exciting things. But maybe the easiest, most consumable story isn't the one journalists should be focused on. Yeah, sure, someone can write yet another story about the chef whose dad lent him $500,000 so he could spend 6 months learning how to make curry foam at some stage in Europe. I, for one, would rather hear about the life of a line cook who works 60 hours a week only for their chef to call them a
fat, useless sack of fucking Yankee doodle shite.
What's really more compelling? Telling stories that make people understand what the problems are and care enough to try to solve them is incredibly important. As Moskin points out, though, we can't stop at the occasional expose about someone's bad boss. Workers need more than just individual accountability to create real change. The issues that plague the industry are endemic, and they proliferate because people are in vulnerable positions.
So far, the investigations that we have been able to do have been in restaurants that tend to employ people with college educations, people who speak English as their first language, people who are not afraid of going to the media for many reasons. And I can't tell you how many investigations I have not been able to do and how many pieces I have not been able to publish because the workers are not in a position to go public. There are many chefs who have not been exposed, who are continuing these kinds of behaviors. And in fact, they're probably worse because they are the kind of people who hire only people who will not talk back to them or speak up against them.
Not everyone has the privilege to stand up for themselves. Many people in the industry would be in dire straits if they lost their job. Most food service workers don't have robust savings accounts that could support a few months or even a few weeks of unemployment. Restaurant workers don't receive benefits like health insurance or retirement accounts, so those costs come out of their pockets if they can afford them in the first place. On top of that, there are millions of undocumented restaurant workers who fear their immigration status puts them at greater risk, especially now. Being fired or potentially deported for sharing their story could ruin someone's life. We have to go beyond calling out problematic individuals and highlight the systems of power that drive them.
I do think that it is our job to get those people to at least think about the many people behind the scenes who make that meal happen. And it's simply by plugging away at it that we might create a universe in which restaurateurs have an incentive to run better kitchens. I don't think we're there yet. And to be honest, I'm not sure how that will change, except by people having radically different expectations of what a restaurant is.
I think that's a really important point, that consumers also have power in the system, and like the way a customer goes into a restaurant, the expectations that they have about what that restaurant is going to look like, and the way that a host is going to lead them to their table exactly at the moment they walk in the door. Those are all things that influence the way that people are treated as well. Part of making a difference in this industry, if consumers actually want to help, is by deciding that they're not just going to go to all of these Michelin star restaurants, and they're not going to only go to restaurants that are like famous on TikTok because they care about other things.
It's so frustrating to know that there's so much money out there and it is going to the fanfare. It's going to the aesthetics. It's going to all of the bullshit that doesn't actually impact the people who are then putting all the food out and putting it up. On the contrary, it requires you actively dismantle and ignore someone's humanity in order to be able to make those margins. I think that that is at like the core of all of this, is that we don't value humanity in its fullness. We don't make the space to actually imagine a different way of eating, of engaging, of growing food, of feeding ourselves.
Yeah, like people are making choices about dining where they're either choosing the absolute cheapest thing, that means that people aren't getting paid because they're not making any money, or they're choosing the absolute most, like, maybe not most expensive thing, but the thing that took the most amount of money to make, and therefore the business is entirely dedicated to making money and nothing else. So they're like you were saying, ignoring the humanity of the labor force and just using them as a sponge to squeeze out money.
Oh my gosh. Maybe when I made the logo for this show, I should have put it on a sponge.
All jokes aside, rejecting the things we're taught to reach for requires imagining something very different from what exists today. But it's hard to strengthen that intellectual muscle, especially when powerful voices are saying it's better if we don't. There are plenty of naysayers who are convinced broad reform is not possible, and even more, that workers shouldn't be asking for it in the first place. What we hear from these people, who are often very influential in the restaurant world, is that workers need to change their expectations rather than change the industry. In short, if workers don't have a thick enough skin to work in the industry, they should leave it. This narrative is really pernicious. Even people who believe in workers' rights can get caught up in it. Take, for instance, the writer, Andrew Friedman, who you heard from in episode 1. While he is by no means a reformer, during our interview, we spoke a bit about how he believes that not everyone in the industry gets a fair shake. His most recent book profiles people in less respected positions all over the industry, in part to show they're people worth knowing about too. And yet here he is repeating this harmful narrative while reflecting on a fine dining restaurant discriminating against a disabled employee.
I don't know if you read the stories about Vespertine. There was a server who had a foot injury and they couldn't wear the shoe you're supposed to wear there. And apparently they tried to accommodate it and they couldn't get it to work. The person was pissed off and gave this interview, and that's not a normal restaurant. You know, like if you break your leg, you can't dance at Lincoln Center in the ballet. I mean, why doesn't the person just go work somewhere else? And, you know, maybe this is a bad fit. I don't know why people choose to stay in a situation where they can probably make at least as much money and have a more fitting work environment when they're, you know, butting heads with the management.
This clip was so many things. You had sent this to me to listen to last week, and I could not contain just the exasperation that I felt listening to this. There is so much that exists in this spectrum of trying to do the right thing, but more often than not, even those people who have evolved past the narrative of the French Brigade is the best way to run a kitchen still perpetuate harm. I like to talk about this on the scale of farming. So you have conventional agriculture. That's the business as usual. That's the French Brigade. This is the way it's always been. Well, I experienced this, so you have to experience this. Then you move into organic agriculture. So you've questioned your impact. You're trying to do better, but organic pesticides are still extremely dangerous. Organic agriculture often is monoculture as well. You don't take another step forward. And then you transition to regenerative agriculture, where you're thinking more about this feedback system of what is actually my role in this system? What are the values that underlie my decision making? How does what I do have the capacity to make what I engage with better? And so I would classify Andrew Freeman as an organic farmer in this conversation, where there's glimpses of evolution of thought. There's glimpses of wanting to do better, but that's still self-interested versus looking at the community and looking at how your internal narratives are then still feeding into this very toxic system.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
I really like the agriculture metaphor for the way we think about labor issues. We have a tendency to see problems and look for the easiest fix without really examining the systems that made those problems exist in the first place. And I think that's essentially what's happening when people from outside the industry talk about solutions to issues in food service. That clip from Andrew Freeman is pretty egregious, but I've heard a lot of people say things to the same effect. Essentially, if you have a problem with your boss or you feel you're being treated poorly, either find a new employer or find a new industry entirely. But when you've worked in restaurants for a long time, it can be exhausting to go from place to place looking for some imagined utopic restaurant where workers are treated with respect. When you don't find it, it's easy to think that the industry isn't the problem. You are. But here's the thing. That restaurant doesn't exist. The issues we're talking about here aren't the fault of a handful of problematic individuals or workplaces. They are industry-wide issues. And yes, the systems that allow them to continue can fuel a world of fraught interpersonal relationships and give horrible people the freedom to do horrible things. There's no doubt about that. But replacing a mean person enforcing an unjust or discriminatory rule with a slightly nicer person doing the same thing isn't fixing the problem. Here's my big takeaway. When you're constantly hearing the same refrain that minimizes your grievances and redirects you to criticize individuals in positions of power, it's really hard to build momentum for real change. And that's where the American obsession with chefs really comes into play. We love to love chefs. They're charismatic, they can be funny and smart and cool. They all have tattoos and know how to sharpen knives, really well. I get it, it's hard to resist. But our focus on them doesn't only obscure the plight of workers and make it hard for them to advocate for themselves. It also provides people who benefit from taking advantage of workers with a really convenient place to point the blame when things go wrong. Reem Assil, a chef and restaurant workers' rights advocate, laid it out.
I do feel sorry for chefs in this system because the way it works out, this system is bad for the quote unquote chef. When you have that amount of immense pressure for you to be scapegoated for everything, it's like either you're the savior or the one who fails everybody.
If we can blame the chef, fire them, and replace them, we aren't changing the systems that allowed that chef to thrive in the first place. The next chef will probably still have a bad temper and talk down to their line cooks, and the one after them will hit on servers and fire them if they balk. Focusing on individual accountability doesn't teach people in power to be better colleagues or bosses or convince them to respect other people. It doesn't solve the problems that make chefs into bad people. It just moves them around and opens up space for someone else to do the same shitty things. It's bad for workers who are being exploited at every turn, and it's bad for chefs who are trained and encouraged to act a certain way and then ostracized for actually doing it.
Wait, Taylor, do you hear that?
Beepity boppity boo.
I think I hear something. What is that?
System systems of oppression hurt everyone.
Thank you, Fairy Woke Mother.
I'll admit, I've struggled to internalize this idea. As is probably apparent from the tone of the last 2 episodes, it's really easy for me to point at restaurant owners and chefs and say, they're the bad guys. And to be honest, a part of me still believes they are. But as with all things, it's important to remember that even the people who benefit from the things that hurt us are also often victims of them. Misogyny hurts women and queer people, but it also makes it difficult for men to cultivate the vulnerability they need to form meaningful relationships. Racism hurts people of color, but it also limits white people's capacity for empathy and paints their world as a scary, dangerous place. The election of Donald Trump threatens the rights and welfare of a lot of the people who voted for him. Chefs are also hurt by the systems that make restaurants bad places to work for the rest of us. Turning a restaurant into a profit-maximizing business takes the joy out of feeding your community. The stress of constantly trying to top the last genius thing you did drives some good people to do really terrible things. We've talked a lot about the abuse chefs deal out to other people, but the pressure of the role has led a number of chefs to die by suicide in the last 10 years. No amount of stress justifies making someone else's life harder for your own benefit. But the need to see each other's humanity goes both ways. And it'll be a lot easier to move forward if we can convince the people in power that the boat they're drilling holes in is the one they're sitting in too. Okay, that's it for this episode. Next week, we'll take a look at where the industry is heading and how we, the media, talk about restaurants and the people who work for them. We'll talk unions, food trends, James Beard Foundation, and how media and restaurant workers can join forces to make the industry better. The Cult of Chef is written, produced, and edited by me, Hannah Chouinard. Our host is the one and only Taylor Early. Cover art for The Cult of Chef is designed by the incredible Michael Hampton. This episode features clips from the HRN series Shift Work. For the link to the full episode, info on the history of the tipped wage, and the links to the studies cited here, check out our show notes.
This episode of From the Pantry was produced by Hannah Chouinard, with support from Sam Girardi, Sasha DeBose, and Addison Austin Liu. From the Pantry is an original limited series that I developed for HRN. Our executive producers are H. Conley and me, Taylor Early. Our audio engineer is Sam Girardi. This program is supported, in part, by the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts, as well as public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. From the Pantry is powered by Simplecast. From the Pantry is a production of Heritage Radio Network, the world's pioneer food radio station. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org and follow us at heritage_radio and at meaty.gram. And in case you haven't already, don't forget to sign up for our new and improved HRN newsletter. You can find the link in our show notes.